Okay, so welcome to We Act TCTAC's Environmental Justice Law and Policy Series. I'm Michelle Florentine, the Environmental and Energy Justice Legal Fellow at the Institute for Policy Integrity. And as part of this TCTAC, Policy Integrity has been hosting a series of trainings focused on providing useful information that can help communities meaningfully engage and influence government decision-making on environmental justice issues. In our first training, we provided a general overview of federal and state EJ laws and policies. In our second training, which we held in October, we provided information on participating in the federal rulemaking process. And in today's training, we'll be providing a general overview of state rulemaking and environmental justice in New York and New Jersey. Before I begin today's meeting, I just want to go over a few meeting logistics. So this meeting is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be shared on our TCTAC website. Please remember to keep yourself muted during the presentation. If you would like Spanish translation, please click on the interpretation globe icon in Zoom. If you don't see it immediately on the bottom of your screen, just click the three dots that say More. And if you have a question prior to the Q&A portion, please drop it in the chat. And during the Q&A section, we're going to answer those questions in the chat, but you can also raise your hand and use the raise hand reaction in Zoom. So let's talk a little bit about the Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center program, also referred to as the TCTAC program. So the TCTAC program was launched by the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, alongside the Department of Energy to ensure that environmental justice communities receive the support they need to benefit from the funding directed by the Justice 40 Initiative, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This TCTAC has a few different goals, and our goals are to build power and knowledge in EJ communities, to create or strengthen EJ networks within a region, to help groups gain access to grant and funding opportunities, and to help groups advance and address environmental and energy justice issues. We have a grant period of 5 years. So this TCTAC is running from 2023 to 2028. And this TCTAC covers part of Region 2, including New York, New Jersey, and the 8 Indian nations of New York. This slide gives you a broader overview of what the TCTAC programs look across the nation. So there are 18 TCTACs in total. 3 are national and 15 are regional. So if you're on today's call and you're not from New York or from New Jersey or the 8 Indian nations of New York, just check out your own region's TCTAC for more information. So let's begin the presentation. Before we dive into the substance, I want to first provide some context for the types of laws and rules that facilities might need to follow or laws and policies that could govern environmental issues in your community. So the first thing I want to talk about are local and municipal regulations. Cities and towns can have their own land use and zoning requirements that dictate how and where things are built. There are also federal and state EJ laws and policies that direct decision makers to say, consider impacts on EJ communities, or maybe create different types of initiatives or procedures that advance EJ goals. We held a training on this in August, so please check out our TCTAC website for more information on this. There's also state common law. So states have their own body of common law that regulates issues such as nuisance, noise, and odors. There's also federal regulation. This involves Congress passing laws and federal agencies issuing rules that implement those laws. We had a training on this in October, so check out our website for more information on that. And for today's presentation, we're going to be talking about state regulation. So state legislatures pass laws and state agencies issue rules to implement those laws and make them a reality. For today's training, we have 2 goals. The first is to understand the basics of state rulemaking processes. And the second is to identify opportunities for public participation in state rulemaking on environmental justice issues. For today's training, we're going to have 3 different sections. The first is we're going to discuss the general state rulemaking process in New Jersey and New York. Then we're going to explore New Jersey's EJ law, the nation's strongest cumulative impacts law for environmental justice communities, as an example of a completed rulemaking process from start to finish. And then we're going to end today with exploring New York's CLCPA, also known as the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, one of the leading state climate laws in the country. And we're going to use this as an example of a current ongoing rulemaking process. The CLCPA is also useful because it has a lot of different moving pieces involved in implementation. So we're going to discuss the moving pieces involved in implementing complex, all-of-government legislation that addresses multiple issues. So let's dive into talking about the state rulemaking process. How can rulemaking be initiated? Generally, their rulemaking is initiated in one of 3 ways. One way involves the legislature passing a law. So the legislature passes a law that specifically directs a state agency to commence rulemaking to implement the law. Also, an agency identifies a need to renew, modify, initiate, or withdraw a rule under their existing authority that's granted by a law. And the third way rulemaking can be initiated is through a petition for rulemaking. So a stakeholder formally files a petition with a state agency to renew, modify, initiate, or withdraw a rule under the agency's existing authority granted by the law. Today, we're going to be focusing on the first category, laws passed by the legislature that direct a state agency to initiate rulemaking. So, how are laws implemented and who implements them? Laws are implemented in different ways to different types of bodies that might implement laws or agencies, and working groups, councils, committees, and advisory boards. Let's talk about agencies first. Agencies or other executive branch entities create rules and guidance to implement laws. And in order to legally make rules, agencies must get their power through the legislature, whether that be through some sort of general grant of authority or through a specific grant of authority over a specific law. And laws usually identify which agency or agencies are tasked with rulemaking. Now, sometimes laws might also direct the creation of working groups, councils, committees, or advisory boards that have specific roles and responsibilities to help implement the law. Some example responsibilities for these types of working groups and advisory boards include creating agency guidance that agencies or other parties should follow to satisfy requirements under the law. Another example is conducting research on issues to inform designing programs or rules, and defining criteria agencies or other parties will need to follow. What is the state rulemaking process? The state rulemaking process generally involves 3 stages: the pre-rule stage, the proposed rule stage, and the final stage, rule stage. The pre-rule stage can involve stakeholder engagement meetings in which agencies solicit input from stakeholders on what issues and concerns the agency should think about when drafting a proposed rule. Agencies might also issue requests for information or advance notices of proposed rulemaking. And this is where the agency announces that they are developing a rule and they want to solicit feedback on specific aspects of it. It's very important to participate in stakeholder engagement and to respond to these types of requests for information because it provides communities with a chance to help shape rules before they're actually drafted and proposed. Now, during the next stage, the proposed rule stage, the agency releases the proposed rule for public comment. And this offers communities a chance to review and analyze what the agency came up with and tell the agency how they think they can improve the law or what the rule, how they can improve the rule or what the rule should look like. And during this last stage, the final rule stage, the agency reviews and may respond to these comments and then releases a final rule. Now, how can the public participate in rulemaking? Well, first, advocates might work with agencies and state entities to develop specific language for rules, methodologies, programs, and other aspects of regulatory frameworks that help take the law and put it into action. Folks can also submit oral testimony or written comments on how agencies can improve their proposed rules. Now, how do you find out about proposed rules and public participation opportunities? In New Jersey, you can go to the Office of Administrative Law Rulemaking website. And on that website, there's this thing called an OAL Rulemaking Notices tab. And you can find more information there. And in New York, you can review the list of, quote, all state rules that's on the New York State Register homepage. Now, we're going to talk about New Jersey's environmental justice law first. And as a reminder, this is a law focused on EJ considerations in permitting and siting. And we're going to use this as an example of how states and EJ stakeholders came together to develop the rules that made this law a reality. So, a little bit of background about what is the New Jersey EJ law and why it's important. As we all might know, polluting facilities are concentrated in overburdened communities, also referred to as OBCs. And these communities are disproportionately burdened with harmful pollution, which results in cumulative impacts. For folks who don't know what cumulative impacts are, it can be summarized as the adverse effects or adverse results of multiple sources of pollution and other environmental stressors. So when communities are exposed to all sorts of pollution from multiple industrial and commercial facilities, all of that pollution compounds and exacerbates environmental health and socioeconomic conditions in communities. Now, New Jersey's EJ advocates led a long campaign to raise awareness of this issue and pressured elected officials to address cumulative impacts with legislation, and their efforts paid off. The New Jersey legislature recognized the issue that was, historically faced in low income and communities of color and came up with the New Jersey EJ law, which aims to provide upfront community engagement before projects are put in OBCs and protect OBCs from additional siting of polluting facilities. New Jersey's EJ law sets specific additional requirements that permit applicants must meet to get approval for their projects in OBCs. And this law applies to applications for new, renewed, and modified permits. It also requires the Department of Environmental Protection, also known as DEP, the state agency that reviews permit applications, to make sure that applicants meet those requirements listed under the law. And under the New Jersey EJ law, DEP can deny and must deny permits for new facilities that disproportionately burden OBCs and do not have a compelling public interest. I should note here that the law itself doesn't actually define what a compelling public interest is, but I'll circle back to this point later in the presentation. So, what types of facilities does the New Jersey EJ law apply to? Well, there are 8 types of facilities covered by New Jersey's EJ law. I won't go through all of these at length, but just to call out a few, it includes gas-fired power plants, incinerators, sewage treatment plants, and landfills. So, what you should know is that when any of these types of facilities try to either 1, build new operations, or 2, expand existing operations in overburdened communities, and they need a permit to do so, those facilities need to satisfy additional requirements that are under the New Jersey EJ law in order to obtain that permit. So, what are permit applicants required to do under this law? Well, first, permit applicants must prepare an environmental justice impact statement, also known as an EJIS, and that assesses the potential environmental and public health stressors associated with the facility, including any adverse stressors the OBC already bears. Then there's a public hearing notice. Applicants must provide notice of the public hearing 60 days prior to the hearing. The public hearing, applicants must conduct a public hearing in the OBC to present the environmental justice impact statement. Then there's a comment period. There is a minimum 60-day public comment period, and during which applicants shall accept written and oral comments. And this public comment period must remain open at least 30 days after the public hearing is held. And then finally, applicants provide the environmental justice impact statement, supplemental information, hearing testimony, all the written comments, and the applicant's response to those comments, and any other relevant information to DEP for its review and final decision. So what is the agency, DEP, required to do under the New Jersey Environmental Justice Law? Well, DEP must review the environmental justice impact statement and any other relevant information, including the testimony and written comments. It also must evaluate whether pollution from the proposed facility would cause or contribute to environmental and public health stressors at levels disproportionate to those in less burdened communities. Where disproportionate impacts are unavoidable, DEP must deny a permit for a new facility unless it serves a compelling public interest. And DEP could limit certain new facilities or subject existing facilities to additional permit conditions that would reduce environmental and public health stressors affecting the overburdened community. The environmental justice law also identifies DEP as the agency who has to adopt rules to implement this law. And it says that DEP may issue technical guidance for compliance with the law. So how did DEP and EJ advocates work together to create rules that implement New Jersey's EJ law? Over the span of 2 years, DEP and EJ advocates met regularly to develop a workable and legally defensible regulatory framework to implement New Jersey's EJ law. Now, the EJ law created strong safeguards against facilities exacerbating pollution and health conditions in OBCs, but the law itself doesn't completely define and describe every key term, methodology, and procedure that permit applicants and DEP need to follow to carry out the EJ law. So this is where rules come into play. Rules help define all of these things and create a regulatory framework that puts this law into action. So together, DEP and EJ advocates developed rules that addressed various key aspects of the EJ law's implementation, including but not limited to identifying who will conduct the cumulative impacts analysis, identifying how DEP should weigh cumulative burden assessment factors, determining whether the OBC screening tool and permit decision-making criteria should consider race, and defining criteria for a compelling public interest that would justify DEP approving a permit that would cause or contribute to disproportionate impacts. So what is included in the rules for New Jersey's EJ law? Well, the rules for this law provide more detailed requirements for permit applicants and DEP. And for example, some rules and requirements pertain to initial screening information and calculation methodology, including how DEP should define adverse environmental and public health stressors, combined stressor totals, cumulative stressors. There's also environmental justice impact statement criteria that permit applicants need to follow. There's specific notice requirements for public hearings, and there's also rules on permit application requirements, such as avoidance of disproportionate impact and control measures. And the last thing I want to highlight right now is that there are rules on the compelling public interest considerations for new facilities. And to quickly summarize this, the rules basically say that there needs to be an essential environmental health or safety need of individuals in the overburdened community, and that the proposed new facility is necessary to serve those essential needs for the OBC, and that there are no reasonable alternatives. So, how long did it take to implement the New Jersey EJ law? So, as you can see, in 2017, the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, the Ironbound Community Corporation, Clean Water Action, and many other EJ advocates amplified their campaigns after many, many years to push New Jersey's government to address EJ issues with a cumulative impacts law. And in September of 2020, Governor Phil Murphy finally signed the EJ law. And from 2020 to 2023, DEP and EJ stakeholders were working together to develop rules implementing this law. And in April of 2023, DEP finalized the rules. So as you can see from this timeline, it took nearly 3 years from the law being signed into law for DEP to finalize rules that allow the law to actually be put into action. So how can advocates get involved in the New Jersey EJ law related matters now? Well, the first thing I want to highlight is this. EJ community engagement sessions to discuss environmental concerns with DEP and EPA Region 2 senior staff are listed on DEP's website. There are also EJ law public hearings, like I mentioned before, regarding permit applications that fall within the extra protections the EJ law provides. And that there's also an EJ directory, or a list of EJ advocates, CBOs, and concerned residents who are dedicated to EJ initiatives in New Jersey and wish to participate in and stay informed about public hearings. And DEP keeps this list on its website for several reasons. The first goal is facilitated outreach. So the DEP provides a directory of people who are interested in enhancing community involvement in public meetings to help facilitate permit applicants' outreach to OBCs. It also intends for directory members to play a vital role in bridging information gaps and empowering OBCs with access to essential information, resources, and updates. And advocates can use the directory to more easily connect with each other on shared environmental justice goals and initiatives. So that includes our first case study. And now we're going to pivot to New York's CLCPA as an example of what is involved in implementing complex, all-of-government laws that are focused on multiple different issues. And we're going to talk about this law because it's a little different from the EJ law. The EJ law is already complete. We've seen it from start to finish, and we already have the rules that are implementing the law. Whereas with the CLCPA, there is an ongoing process to implement this law and create rules that really accomplish the CLCPA's mission. So, what is the CLCPA and why is it important? Well, the CLCPA is a holistic climate law that includes ambitious requirements for reducing statewide greenhouse gases and aims to ensure equitable distribution of benefits associated with clean energy investments. Agencies need to develop regulatory frameworks and undertake various activities, such as issuing permits, to ensure that the state reaches its climate and energy targets. One example that I want to highlight, because I'm going to talk about it a bit later, is New York Cap and Invest. So DEC and NYSERDA are designing New York Cap and Invest to satisfy DEC's requirement under the CLCPA to create a economy-wide emissions reduction program by 2024. And this New York Cap and Invest is going to really help the state reduce its greenhouse gas emissions and reach its climate goals under the law. Now, the CLCPA has a lot of different provisions that are related to environmental justice concerns. I won't list all of them, but I want to list a few of them here. One has to do with net increases in co-pollution. So activities undertaken to implement the CLCPA cannot result in a net increase in co-pollutants or otherwise disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. And I'm going to refer to disadvantaged communities as DACs throughout this presentation. There's also another provision about state agency approvals and decisions. So in considering and issuing permits, licenses, and other administrative approvals and decisions, all state agencies and entities need to avoid disproportionate burdens in DACs. And all state agencies and entities shall also prioritize reducing co-pollutants and greenhouse gases in DACs. And another provision that I want to highlight is the benefits of spending provision. And this says that DACs shall receive at least 35% with a goal of 40% of the benefits of spending on clean energy and energy efficiency programs, projects, or investments that are going to be coming out of the CLCPA. So who is implementing the CLCPA? The Department of Environmental Conservation, the Public Service Commission, and various other agencies and entities are responsible for implementing different provisions in the CLCPA. This CLCPA called for the creation of councils and working groups as well. And I'm going to walk through a couple of these. So the first one I want to highlight is the Climate Action Council, which is tasked with convening advisory boards, working groups, and public meetings to develop and finalize the scoping plan. And the scoping plan is a regulatory framework for how New York will satisfy various CLCPA requirements. There's also the Climate Justice Working Group, which was tasked with developing different types of environmental, health, and socioeconomic criteria to identify DACs in New York. The other group that I want to highlight is the Just Transition Working Group, which is tasked with preparing recommendations on how to address workforce development impacts. Now, the CLCPA implementation requires interagency action. So there are a lot of moving parts. And in this part of the presentation, I'm going to give you only a few select snapshots of what these moving parts look like. This is not meant to overwhelm you, even though I admit it is a little bit overwhelming. But I'm walking you through this to give you a broad sense of how complex laws like the CLCPA might call for multiple opportunities for public engagement with various different agencies. And yes, this is what I just said. Agencies and entities are tasked with the CLCPA's implementation. They've been already holding stakeholder engagement and public comment periods concerning potential programs and initiatives. So some of these public comment periods have already passed, but given that the CLCPA is still being implemented, there may be other opportunities for public comment and participation. So how is the CLCPA being implemented? Agencies and entities are progressing towards implementing the CLCPA at different rates. So agencies are behind schedule with meeting many statutory deadlines established by this law. I'm going to go through a couple of examples of agency and entity actions to implement the CLCPA. So the Climate Action Council drafted the scoping plan that I mentioned before, the interagency cross-sector framework for implementing the CLCPA, which involved holding various advisory panel meetings, stakeholder outreach, and public comment periods. DEC and NYSERDA are designing New York Cap and Invest, which I mentioned before, to satisfy its requirements to establish an economy-wide emissions reduction program. They have not actually introduced an actual proposal to date, but I do want to flag that some of the proceeds from New York and Cap and Invest should be benefiting DACs. DEC and NYSERDA also proposed guidance on how agencies and entities should report benefits of spending accounted for in DACs. So what have been some of the challenges and ongoing concerns with implementing the CLCPA? Well, the first one that I've already mentioned is meeting statutory deadlines. So overall, the state is behind, behind schedule on meeting CLCPA statutory deadlines. Another concern is addressing DAC-related needs. So something I want to highlight is developing decarbonization plans that would actually address co-pollution and energy affordability concerns. And these issues have been raised in various different forums, including the scoping plan and during the New York and Cap and Invest stakeholder engagement process. Also, there are issues with the DAC investment and benefits of spending guidance. So there's been issues creating an investment and benefits spending framework that aligns with the law statutory language. So the first thing I want to show you is just a snapshot of how the scoping plan was made. In 2019, Governor Andrew Cuomo signed the CLCPA, and in March of 2020, the Climate Action Council held its first meeting. Then 7 sector-specific advisory councils or advisory panels conducted stakeholder outreach, received feedback, and further developed recommendations. In December of 2023, the Climate Action Council released the draft scoping plan after holding nearly 20 public meetings. And then from September to December of 2021, the Climate Action Council held public comment periods involving 11 public hearings, and more than 35,000 written comments were submitted. So a lot of public participation from all sorts of stakeholders, not just environmental justice advocates. Then from June to October of 2022, the Climate Action Council subgroups reviewed this feedback and further developed the scoping plan. And in December of 2022, the Climate Action Council voted to advance the scoping plan that we have today. I want to now shift to a snapshot of the process for designing New York Cap and Invest. So I'm just going to briefly show you the process as another example of the various steps involved in designing specific programs and rules that go into satisfying one requirement in the CLCPA. So this means just one element of the scoping plan that I just went over. So this timeline shows you what stages we've already completed. There was an initial stage of pre-proposal outreach. Then DEC assessed input and further developed the pre-proposal. Then there was a second stage of pre-proposal outreach. And right now, the agencies are assessing this input and trying to develop a proposal. Now, the next stage will include issuing a regulatory proposal, having a formal comment period and hearing, and then the agency is going to take all of this feedback and do an assessment of the public comments. Now, there's going to be after all of this is done, there's going to be a final rule stage where the agency issues final regulations, has a mandatory reporting process that begins, and then also compliance begins. As you can see, we're currently at a stage where we're assessing the second round of pre-proposal outreach, but we should actually already be at the stage where we're issuing final regulations. And during all of this process, DEC and NYSERDA were holding EJ advocates were involved in making sure that different types of concerns related to co-pollutants and DACs were addressed. Now, how is the CLCPA's benefits of spending provision being implemented? So, the benefits of spending provision, just as a recap, says that DACs shall receive at least 35% with a goal of 40% of the benefits of spending on clean energy and energy efficiency programs, projects, and investments. So DEC and NYSERDA released a draft DAC investments and benefits reporting guidance. And this categorizes the different types of programs and funding sources that state entities will need to report for state compliance with the benefits of spending provision listed above. There has been some statutory interpretation issues. So the guidance uses unclear terms that conflate investments and benefits together. And the potential consequence of this is incorrect tracking of spending and benefits that flow to DACs. DEC and NYSERDA held virtual information sessions and a public comment period in which several community members raised the statutory interpretation issue and potential consequence. But DEC and NYSERDA have yet to finalize this guidance or respond to these comments. So we have to stay tuned. It's a bit unclear if DEC is going to release a final guidance or if they're going to initiate another round of public comment before finalizing the guidance, which some of the public comments recommended. But remember that at all stages of developing rules, programs, and other initiatives to implement the CLCPA, there are going to be similar opportunities such as this to engage with executive agencies and entities to have your ideas and concerns heard and potentially influence how this law can benefit your community. So I just want to end on one final takeaway before we switch to the Q&A section. Complex laws like the CLCPA have various requirements, which means that agencies need to make a lot of different rules. And keeping track of all these moving pieces is quite the balancing act. And instead of being overwhelmed by this process, it's good to focus on identifying the agencies that are making the rules or guidance that are important to your community. Look at your state registers and see if those agency websites, look at those state registers and also look at those agency websites to figure out what rulemaking procedures are upcoming and just to stay informed about different public participation opportunities for rules that are important to your community. And also remember that this is a long process. I just want to end on this screenshot of how long it's taking to implement the CLCPA. We started in 2019 with Andrew Cuomo signing the CLCPA. And, you know, the CLCPA was a big part of Governor Cuomo's legacy. We have had a switch in administration since then in August 2021. It remains a bit unseen if the current administration is going to prioritize the CLCPA's implementation to the same degree. And so we just have to keep our eye on how long it's taking to implement this, but remain patient. There are going to be opportunities to get engaged, have your community's voices and concerns heard, and hopefully shape the rules that allow for all of the great benefits the CLCPA has to offer to make sure that those benefits end up in your community. So I'm going to end here and start the Q&A section. If folks have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or to drop your question in the chat.
So we have some questions that we got prior to the training, so we can get to those since I don't see any in the chat right now. I'll pull this first one up. The question is, how can government help EJ communities best and or advance state regulations that advance EJ accountability? So I think what this person's referring to is, you talked a lot about what is the process of how rules are made and how laws are implemented and how communities can engage it. And I think the question here is, how can the government um, be like a better participant in this process to get better EJ outcomes?
I think that something that, say, rules like the EJ law and the CLCPA are trying to establish are accountability mechanisms for government having to proactively engage environmental justice communities in decision making. So, if you're in a situation where you're trying to make sure that the government is staying true to its missions behind these types of laws, use the law itself as a way to say, hey, you're supposed to do X, Y, and Z in this law to make sure that our voices are heard in decision making. Please do that. But there are also other types of ways to engage government in environmental justice issues. And what we saw during the EJ laws, the campaign for the EJ law and its implementation was that EJ advocates who originally had this idea for a cumulative impacts law were going to their elected officials. They were calling them up, they were knocking on doors and trying to get the attention of the folks that they voted in office to care about what was happening in their communities. And they stuck with it at all levels, whether it was during the brainstorming of having the law itself, or they, force their way into rooms to make sure that their opinions were implemented when agencies were trying to create these rules. So I think there are ways for you to both use the rules and laws that are out right now to make sure that environmental justice communities have space to really influence decision making. But also, there are opportunities for folks to really create partnerships with folks in different government offices to make sure that we're advancing environmental justice in these states.
I see a hand raised from Coeli.
Yes, I saw a post that I'm in a railway station. So I was a little to come on and I was kind of listening to what was it about New Jersey's impact law, and I'm just curious to a couple of things. What if there's a project that's initiating, is the person that's required to file a permit or whatever, are they supposed to be knowledgeable of the laws that impact that site or facility? Is it the city or even county entity that makes sure that they follow the rules and regulations with that policy? Is it advocate in the community that reminds them of these laws? And I'm just trying to figure out if we're chasing behind a situation that's occurring in our community, how do we, like, what's our avenue? Is it a legal process? Is it, I don't know. I don't know if any of this makes sense, but just understand what things are. I'm living in a community where things that are happening, and so we're wondering how can we use this law to then affect some kind of change or. I
Yeah,
hope that makes some kind of sense.
yeah, I think I caught most of your question. You were cutting out a little bit, but I think I'll start by if folks really see my screen? Val, you can let me know if not. But in terms of who is accountable for making sure that permit applicants follow the EJ law and maybe other similar laws that impact environmental issues, I'll speak to that first. So permit applicants, they should know about this law at this point. And so when they are applying for a permit, they also, if the Department of Environmental Protection sees that they're in an OBC with its own screening tool, then that permit applicant, they're going to go back and say to the permit applicant, you need to complete this environmental justice impact statement. You need to fulfill the meaningful public participation opportunities requirements, and so on and so forth. But what's happening right now is permit applicants, they may also just elect to submit the environmental justice impact statement with their permit application. So long answer short, permit applicants, they are not allowed to get a permit if they don't fulfill the requirements under this law. In terms of like what DEP is doing on their end, they're reviewing all of this information that is coming both from the permit applicant and from communities. So, for example, there's only been, to my knowledge, one department decision post this law being put into action. And in that decision, DEP reviewed all of the permit application materials and the comments. And in its decision, they decided, okay, there is a disproportionate impact here. And also they pointed to a comment letter that the Ironbound Community Corporation and others had signed on to say that there may be other types of equal protection violations here because it was a community that was low income and it was a predominantly minority community. And so that's an example of communities coming in and having their voices recognized in this department decision. And so in terms of what communities can do, let me just reshare my slide if possible. I just want to re-highlight this bit of the presentation. So yes, now we're at a point where this law is put into action. There are different ways for communities to stay on top of permit applications and department decisions. If you go on DEP's website, they have a page dedicated to the environmental justice law. They have guidance documents that permit applicants can review, and they also have resources such as what's listed on the screen, where there are like community engagement sessions where communities can attend, discuss the different types of environmental concerns that they have in their backyard, and DEP and EPA Region's two senior staff are going to be present to answer those questions. In terms of like what's required in the law, you know how I talked about how permit applicants, they're required under the law to hold public hearings regarding their applications. There's a bunch of requirements in the EJ law rules about what they have to talk about during that public hearing. And they have to explain to the community what their environmental justice impact statement, what their findings were, if there is a disproportionate impact, where the facility is going to be sited, if it's a new facility, if it's a facility that's already there, they have to explain like the changes to their operations. And you can get information on when these type of public hearings are happening on DEP's website. If you can either go directly on their website, or when we circulate these slides, you can click on the hyperlinks here and you'll see like the date, time, and location of when permit applicants are going to be holding these hearings in the overburdened community. And like another way for you to get connected and stay connected to environmental justice law related matters is either signing up for this EJ directory that the DEP holds, or using it as a way to connect with people who are already on it to try to figure out what's happening in different communities and different types of environmental justice initiatives that are happening related to this law. Al, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I think that's all right. And the DEP site, as Michelle points out, actually has a lot of information. In fact, maybe almost too much information. But I think, going back to the earlier question about what can the government do to better engage EJ communities and get better EJ accountability, part of it is access to information. So there's a lot of things that are required to be posted on the site. As Michelle's pointing out, if any of these permit conditions are triggered. We did get another question related to this from Shirley. I don't have a last name here, but it's is there monitoring post-permit approval? So I'm assuming she's wondering whether, and it's an interesting question actually, whether the EJ law process itself can result, for example, in required monitoring if it's approved. Obviously, if the permit is not approved, there's nothing to monitor. But
I would have to go back and review the rules themselves. I will flag that if you go on DEP's website and you click on the rules document, it's 55 pages long. So it's a little bit, it takes a minute for you to sort through everything. But I feel like I recall that there are certain provisions in the rules that deal with monitoring specific conditions that might be imposed on permit applicants and their facilities. So if you actually provide your email address, I can get back to you with more information on that. But what I will say separately is that permit applicants, they need to renew their permits. So they're going to have to show if they're keeping up with the conditions in those permits as well.
the only thing I would add to that too is that, part of this whole process, what it requires is that permit applicant to prepare the hearing, prepare the impact statement and hold the hearing. And that is something that communities should be asking for. Is this monitor? I mean, you want to ask for things like the monitoring. You want to, things that meet. If the law for that particular permit requires monitoring, that's one thing. If it doesn't, that's something that you could ask for in that process. I think. That's part of why that whole process is set up, is to create that dialogue between the community and the project applicant. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's DEP that would have to decide whether to grant the permit or not grant it, or what other conditions they might set on it. So that's probably where you would have this monitoring post-permit. But I think Michelle made a great point too, that these permits do need to get renewed, and maybe they might see that it's an overburdened community, but determine that the current permit is not going to add any additional disproportionate EJ concerns. But I think that's something the community can ask for, is we want monitoring to make sure that remains the case in the long term when they come back for the permit renewal. You want to collect that data. So anyways, that was a great question. I think we have time maybe for one more question.
Before we get to that question, I just want to circle back to the previous question, because there's one thing that just crossed my mind. In terms of what communities can do, I do want to uplift what Al just said. It's critical to participate in the public comment period and the public hearing period to make sure that concerns that are not being addressed by the environmental justice impact statement are actually raised, because that becomes part of the record that the department is going to look at when they're making their final decision. But there is a clause in the rules that says that if folks do not agree with DEP's final decision, they can request an adjudicatory hearing to contest the final decision. And there are different types of requirements that you have to fulfill when you're doing that request for a hearing. You do have to show some sort of factual or legal argument as to why the decision is wrong. But that is also another advocacy avenue that communities can use to, really hold permit applicants accountable for potential increases in pollution in their communities.
Okay, we have another question here. What is the most compelling ways to influence the PSC? I'm assuming they're talking about the Public Services Corporation. What I'm just going to say here is that we are doing a training in the spring in procedural justice in engaging public utility commissions or public service commissions. So the person who asked that question, that will be addressed in a future training. We just decided to put that into another whole training itself because those entities are a whole nother area of engagement with very different rules, and we wanted to cover kind of what that universe looks like. So if that person can just put a pin in that and just pay attention, look for the training this spring on procedural justice and public utility commissions, and we'll talk a lot about what are different ways to engage them that because of the different rules as far as public participation. So the last question we have here, which I mean, I think it's interesting in the sense that it's like we're talking a lot about this New Jersey State EJ law, and it's state agencies, and the question is how to hold municipalities accountable for noncompliance.
I think that as the way you should view this is that there is a bit of a hierarchy in government bodies and which laws rule. So, like what we covered in a previous training is that the federal law preempts everything. The federal law is the law of the land. And so if there's a federal law that conflicts with a state law, the federal law trumps, right? Now, state law similarly is the supreme law over municipalities and towns. And so municipalities have to be following this law as well. And so the same way we're talking about like keeping permit applicants accountable to this law, that they have to fulfill this law and all of its requirements. It applies to everyone in the state, regardless of whatever municipality you're in. Municipalities might also have additional cumulative impact laws, though, that permit applicants are going to need to follow in order to make sure that like this law is properly being enacted and followed. And there's a clause in the environmental justice law rules about how permit applicants also have to do their own due diligence to make sure that they're not only following the state law, but any local laws as well. I'm not sure if I misunderstood that question. Al, feel free to add or interject.
Well, the only thing I would add, I think you answered. I think the only thing I would add is that it is possible that the municipality itself could be the one applying for a permit. So let's say municipality wants to open, and I'm just using this as an example, like a landfill or some kind of facility that falls under one of those 8 different facilities. They would be the one that would have to go through the process. So it's like, on one hand, Michelle's absolutely right. Like the applicant coming in has to comply with the state law, and that might involve also complying with the local municipal laws too. And I mean, that's the other thing too. I think maybe where this question is coming from is that what role do municipalities have in ensuring environmental justice? And I think, Michelle, you were kind of getting at it before. It's like the New Jersey EJ law applies to state environmental permitting for those 8 different types of facilities that Michelle pointed out earlier in the project. But like what municipalities themselves can do, this was covered in the first slide, is they're the ones who are more engaged even before that permit usually comes up. There's like a land use for it. They need like an applicant needs a site, and they might need to get zoning, get a site ownership or zone approved for a particular use. That would be the municipality. So that is a process there where communities can engage that process, but that's separate and apart from the New Jersey EJ law, which is like now someone's applying for a permit for a facility, right? So a little bit of nuance there, but I mean, they're kind of different venues and they have different jurisdictions. But I mean, generally, maybe one thing we could say is that, municipalities in some ways are more accountable to public citizens because they're closer to where you live. A state regulator's got to think about the whole state. That municipality is thinking about the people who live in that town. So, I mean, if you're in that township, you're voting for those people who are in leadership in that office. So there's a lot more accountability there. But again, over different issues, probably more around land use, siting than the permitting itself. So I think we're out of time. Michelle, do you want to wrap up? And yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks everyone who joined today. Just as a reminder, these slides and the recording of the presentation are going to be posted on the TCTAC site. But if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at ejtictac@weact.org. Also visit our website. And I encourage you to complete our survey to let us know if you what you found helpful about this presentation. And lastly, please join our mailing list if you have not already. This is a great way to stay updated on not just Policy Integrity's EJ Law and Policy series, but also different types of training that might relate to upcoming grant opportunities and the like. So thank you so much. Take a shot of these QR codes, and I hope you have a lovely day.